Yes, so hello, good morning. This is Anirban Dutta. So I'm from the Center for SMBQ, and today we have Professor Glenn Wylie. He's the director of the Rocco Ortenzio Neuroimaging Center at the Kessler Foundation, and he's also professor at the Rutgers University Medical School. So yes, Dr. Wylie, so he got his BSc in from Dalhousie University and then his DPhil from Oxford University. And yeah, he was supported by leading institutions in the US, NIH, VA, New Jersey State Commissions, foundations. And his research focus is in cognitive neurosciences, specifically cognitive control, cognitive fatigue, which are the areas of interest that we have in our group. So without further ado, I would have Professor Glenn Wylie to start on cognitive fatigue.
Thank you, Anirban. All right. Yeah. So, yeah. Thanks for inviting me. This is cool. Yes, I'm going to be talking about cognitive fatigue today, and what it is. Let's see. So here's the overview of my talk. What fatigue is and what it is not. Framework for understanding fatigue, and then leveraging this knowledge for treatment of fatigue, and then implications for our understanding of fatigue is what I'll finish off with. Okay, so here's the my humor slide. Who's affected by fatigue? Liberals are affected by fatigue. Conservatives are affected by fatigue. Everyone's affected by fatigue, right? Yeah, the slide was funnier about what 4 or 6 years ago. Anyway, and then I've sort of been casting about how to show what fatigue is. And one example I found that I like is from The Open Boat by Stephen Crane. And the way, and this is a story about someone who's like becoming fatigued, becoming physically exhausted. And the way Stephen Crane shows this is by having this chunk of text that just gets shorter. It's repeated throughout the story, but it gets shorter each time. And this shows, that this person is just getting more and more fatigued. And so fatigue is an instantaneous readout of effort expenditure over time. That's kind of what I take away from that. There are other disciplines where you can have a great quote, like a William James quote, but fatigue doesn't seem to be like that. Anyway, so that's sort of the preamble, and then moving into like what fatigue really is. It's hard to define fatigue, and there have been inconsistent definitions. So here's a definition from the Neurological Fatigue Index in MS, which is fatigue is a reversible motor and cognitive impairment with reduced motivation and a desire to rest, either appearing spontaneously or brought on separately by mental or physical activity, humidity, acute infection, or food ingestion. And then from the visual analog scale of fatigue, it defines fatigue as a subjective state of weariness related to reduced motivation, prolonged mental activity, or boredom that occurs in situations such as chronic stress, anxiety, or depression. And then just another one, fatigue is the fatigue assessment inventory. Says fatigue is a sense of tiredness, lack of energy, or total body give out. So you can see there's a lot of variability in how fatigue is defined. And there's some commonalities in the ones I've chosen, which have to do with motivation, which you'll see is kind of important, or we think is kind of important. But then there are other things that are sort of a little bit idiosyncratic, like humidity and, total body give out. So there's inconsistency in the definitions of fatigue. And then there's inconsistencies in the assessment of fatigue. So there are only over 250 instruments to assess fatigue that have been developed over the years. And they have divergent definitions, like I've just shown, and assumptions. Many conflate fatigue with other potentially related constructs. like attention and concentration. So there are questions like, I have had trouble concentrating. Memory, where it asks if the people have been forgetful, and processing speed, things like where items are like, my thinking has been slowed down. And all of these assessments rely on retrospective self-report. So now I'm going to take a minute and talk about retrospective self-report and hopefully make you doubt that it is a great thing. So what do we actually mean when we ask people to retrospectively assess their fatigue? So here's some synthetic data that I made up, and the idea here was that, what if you ask someone to rate their fatigue every hour of the day, of their waking day for 2 weeks, and you might get this sort of pattern. And I think when we ask people to rate their fatigue over the last 2 weeks, for example, what we're kind of hoping for, implicitly anyway, is that they'll somehow sort of integrate their instantaneous level of fatigue over that time period and give us an answer, right? And so in this case, it's like 15,500 fatigue hours, 15,500-ish fatigue hours over a 2-week span. And, and I think if we ask someone if that's really what they think our subjects are doing, they would say, no, I don't think that's really what they're doing, even if we implicitly hope that they're doing something like that. Instead, maybe we think that they're doing something like giving us a mean fatigue over that time span, which would be about 46.99 out of, on the scale of 0 to 100. Maybe we think that they set some sort of threshold and they rate their fatigue based on how many time points or how many days, their fatigue exceeded that threshold. So in this case, 7. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the other thing is that we all know that there's this sort of recency cost function, right? So fatigue occurring more recently is going to be weighted more heavily than fatigue occurring further in the past. And I've tried to get at that here by making past events become increasingly gray and blurry. And we don't really know how that factors into subjective self-report. And then whatever they do when we ask them, we then ask them to translate their response into something like this, like a Likert scale, 1 to 7. So this is actually, an item on a fatigue scale. I am easily fatigued, and you rate that as strongly agreeing or disagreeing to some extent on a Likert scale. And so, how do you translate an integration of your fatigue or the mean or the threshold into that Likert scale? We don't really know. So things we don't know. We don't know how people make the estimate of their fatigue, whether it's an integral or a mean or whatever. We don't know what their baseline is. So if their mean is 46, we don't know if that's high or, average or anything. We don't know how memory affects the estimate. So what is the recency cost function? And then we don't know how the estimate is transformed into the rating we actually observe. So is 46 a 4 because it's around the middle, or is it a 7 because it's high for that person? And then we suspect that all of these differ across individuals and within individuals, probably across time. And so retrospective self-report, I hope I have made you doubt. So maybe we should sort of turn to performance related definitions. So here's one, that fatigue is the awareness of a decreased capacity for physical and or mental activity due to an imbalance in the availability, utilization, and or restoration of resources needed to perform an activity. Or, more succinctly, fatigue is a decline in performance that occurs in any prolonged or repeated task. So that sounds sort of good, and it kind of, fits with our intuition about how fatigue works. But but it doesn't fit with the data because under fatiguing conditions, performance sometimes declines, sometimes remains unchanged, and sometimes even improves as time on task increases.
It's frozen for me. I don't know if everyone is having the same issue. Same here.
Yeah, same here.
Okay.
Ackerman said sometimes it increases, and I think he meant improves.
So did you see only the first slide, or did you see few slides and then it stopped progressing? Hello.
Our interconnection is unstable.
Hi, Anirban. I think it just froze for a few seconds, but it's now back.
Now back, okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Okay, good. So, well, all right. So I'm not sure where it froze, but this is so the point here, assuming we're back, yeah, is that decades of research have replicated the fact that cognitive performance can improve over time as fatigue increases, and and in other domains of research, we call this the practice effect, right? It's the single most well replicated effect in all of psychological literature. People get better over time, and this is true even when they're getting fatigued. And so there's been this lack of relationship between objective performance and subjective fatigue over the past 100 years, and that's probably one of the most consistent findings in the fatigue literature. Okay, so what's going on here? And the way I think about this has to do with driving. So in driving, as people become more fatigued, their driving performance deteriorates, right? We know this. They become less sensitive to detecting potential targets, that's been shown. But it's critical that overall error rates remain at 0. And so how do we do that? Well, we do that by becoming more conservative, right? We become defensive drivers. And so there's a signal detection theory is sort of a framework in which we can understand, or it's developed to sort of pull apart how sensitive you are versus versus your response biases. So it uses the types of errors people make to pull these things apart, to look at response bias, which can be conservative or liberal, and sensitivity or perceptual certainty, which is the ability to distinguish targets from non-targets. And it was actually developed by Bell Labs. They were interested in people being able to distinguish targets from non-targets on a telephone line. And for them, response bias was kind of a nuisance variable. But for us, it's kind of, I think it's where the interesting things lie. Okay. So the way this works is that a stimulus can be present or absent, and subjects can respond that the stimulus is present or absent. And so if the stimulus is present and the subject says it's present, then that's a hit because they correctly got that the target was there. If the stimulus was absent and they said it was present, well, that's a false alarm because they said it was there when it wasn't. If the stimulus is present and they said it was absent, that was a miss because it was there and they didn't get it. And if the stimulus was absent and they said it was absent, well, that was a correct rejection. Okay. And so you can sort of push how people respond around a little bit by changing the balance of effort of how you reward different responses. So if I say, okay, every time you get one right, I'm going to give you £1, and every time you get one wrong, I'm going to take away 50 pence or 5 pence. Let's do 5 pence. Well, then what are you going to do? You're going to respond anytime there could possibly be a target, right? And that's going to optimize your hits. You're going to get a lot of hits. You're also going to get some false alarms, but you don't really care because I'm only taking away 5 pence. And if I swap that around and say, okay, every time you get one right, I'm going to give you, 50 pence. And every time you get one wrong, I'm going to take away £1. Well, that's going to make you much more conservative, right? You're going to only respond when you're really sure. And so you're going to you're going to correctly reject a lot of stimuli when they're not there, but you're also probably going to miss some. And so by changing the payoff matrix, we can change people's response biases. Okay, so we used that in this paper, and our hypothesis was that as people become more fatigued, they will adopt a more conservative response bias. And so we looked at this in 48 healthy participants, and they worked through 4 blocks of a difficult task, a difficult working memory task, and each block lasted 5 minutes. And they worked through 4 blocks of control tasks, and that also, each block lasted 5 minutes. We acquired fMRI while they were working through these things, and at baseline, and then after each block, they rated their fatigue on a scale from 0, meaning they were not fatigued at all, to 100, meaning they were maximally fatigued. Okay, and what we found was that indeed, as fatigue increased here on the x-axis, their response bias increased, which meant that they became more conservative. So there was this positive relationship between fatigue and response bias. And replicating what has been shown in the literature in the past, as fatigue increased, their sensitivity, or D prime, decreased. And that was also significant. So that's great. But then we also thought, okay, so let's go and look at simple reaction time, simple accuracy rather. So when we collapse across these types of errors, false alarms and all that stuff, what happens when we look at fatigue versus simple accuracy, and there's no relationship. So this also replicates what has been found before, where people expect that there'll be some sort of relationship between fatigue and accuracy, and they don't find it. And we didn't find it either, unless we pulled apart accuracy into its constituent parts. But subjects were more accurate when they were performing the easier task. Okay. And then in terms of the brain, when we look in the brain and the caudate nucleus, we find this relationship between fatigue, which is I'm showing you here on the x-axis, and percent signal change now on the y-axis. And you can see that as fatigue increases, activity in the caudate over here on the left decreases. Or to put that the other way, more activation in the caudate is associated with less fatigue. And then when we looked, instead of looking at fatigue, when we looked at people's response criteria, and we found the same relationship, this time on the other side, in the right caudate, but the same relationship, same negative correlation between, in this case, response criterion and percent signal change. So what do we conclude from all that? Well, fatigue really is related to poor performance. So our intuition about how fatigue works turns out to be true. Sensitivity declines as fatigue increases. But people can compensate for that. Turns out we're pretty clever. And we can change our response bias, and we can become more conservative. And we can control our errors. And so this results in overall unchanged error rate. And brain areas that showed sensitivity to fatigue also showed sensitivity to changes in response bias, and specifically the caudate nucleus of the striatum. So fatigue may be the brain's way of telling itself that there's been a change in the payoff matrix, and that there's been this disadvantageous change between the balance of effort and reward. And so the idea here is that, you know, effort increases as you are working away at these tasks because you're running out of cognitive resources, because you're, you know, constantly using your brain, but the reward remains unchanged. Now, we didn't actually give people an explicit reward here, aside from paying them for their time. The reward here was more like, you know, making yourself look good in front of the experimenter. Like, people don't want to look bad, right? And so that was the only reward here. But in any case, the fact that there was no reward didn't change, whereas effort did. Okay, I'll talk about changing rewards in a minute. Okay, so then we went, and so then we thought, okay, so let's look at this in MS and see what happens, what signal detection theory can tell us about fatigue in MS. And so we used the same paradigm, and we had 30 folks with MS. Most of them had relapsing or remitting MS, and 20 controls who were matched on age and education. And here are their fatigue ratings. So I'm showing you, you know, the 5 fatigue ratings. So 1 at baseline, and then a fatigue rating after each of the 4 runs of the task. You can see controls here in the sort of reddish color, didn't really change much, but the folks with MS, they came in with higher fatigue at the very beginning, and then their fatigue increased as they went along. And that resulted in this group by rating interaction. And then when we look at response bias, we found that folks with MS had higher response bias than controls. So this, you know, sort of an overall higher response bias, which I think is related to their sort of increase in fatigue at baseline. And as fatigue increased, participants became more conservative, just like I showed you before. So the response bias increased as fatigue increased, almost significantly in this case, 0.06. And then we went and looked in the brain here in the caudate, which I've shown this little blue arrow over here. We found this interaction between fatigue and group in terms of percent signal change. So that's what I'm showing you in this graph. So there's fatigue on the x-axis, and you can see that the healthy control group, for them, higher activation in the caudate was related to less fatigue, just like before. But that really wasn't true in the MS group. It was sort of flat. If anything, it was a positive slope. And when we looked at response bias, we found again the same relationship in the basal ganglia, and so, you know, the healthy controls had this negative relationship between response bias and activation or percent signal change, and the MS group really didn't. If anything, a positive relationship. So what do we make of that? So response bias, again, mirrors fatigue. Folks with MS report more fatigue than controls and have higher, more conservative response bias. And the brain areas that are sensitive to fatigue are also sensitive to response bias, specifically the caudate nucleus of the basal ganglia. So what we make of this is that individuals with MS may need to expend more cognitive resources or effort to perform a given task than controls. You know, they have more brain activation is required for them to perform the same task than healthy controls. So that's like, you know, in the literature, lots of people have shown that. And this may skew the balance between effort and reward, or the payoff matrix, such that everything takes more effort when you have a neurodegenerative disease like MS. And so you're chronically, therefore, more fatigued. And fatigue may be the brain's way of signaling that this has occurred. Okay. So how might we leverage these results to treat fatigue? So there's no unequivocally effective treatment, as you guys already probably know. There have been reports of medications that have been helpful, So medications that increase dopamine seem to reduce fatigue in cancer, in TBI, in chronic fatigue syndrome, and in Parkinson's disease. But the evidence for this is not great. You know, it's been reported that it does, but it hasn't been, but then there have been non-replications and things. And then there are non-pharmaceutical methods like cognitive behavioral therapy and exercise that have also shown some efficacy. And so we came along and said, okay, well, what about targeting the basal ganglia? And so I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to talk about the basal ganglia and fatigue. So Chiduri and Bahan back in the early 2000s published this theory that fatigue involves the non-motor functions of the basal ganglia. And they thought that central fatigue was a result of a failure in the integration of limbic input and non-motor functions within the basal ganglia affecting the striatal thalamic frontal cortical system. So what does basal ganglia do? You guys probably know what the basal ganglia does, but it's involved in motor functions, of course. It's also involved in decision-making and learning and motivation and reward processing, importantly for us. And it has widespread dopaminergic projections to the prefrontal cortex. And so it links the motivational reward processing to fatigue via the dopaminergic system. So there are these loops within the basal ganglia, and we think that the motivational loop is important for fatigue, and that involves the thalamus, global pallidus, and substantia nigra, the ventral striatum, and then the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. There may be, yeah. That's the one we think is most involved. Let me put it that way. And then what does the motivational loop do? So it's involved in learning and outcome prediction. So, you know, for example, learning that if you study, you're more likely to get a good grade in a class than if you don't study, in which case you're more likely to get a bad grade. And it's involved in outcome prediction. Like when you go to Las Vegas and you ask yourself, will I, do I win if I bet on red? It's your basal ganglia that gets excited by that, even though the answer is probably always no. It's not always no. That's the problem. It's not always no, but it's not always yes. And this is a dopamine dependent mechanism. Okay, and then looking at the motivational loop and reward. So animal studies have shown that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and striatal neurons fire to reward delivery. And then in humans, folks have found that greater ventral medial prefrontal cortex and striatal activation are related to reward presentation. How are we doing on time?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now I'm going to sort of pull in dopamine. So we know that the motivational network is sensitive to the presentation of rewards and punishments, like I just said. We know that dopamine is released during reward presentation. And the dopamine agonists increase reward seeking and enhance activation of the motivational network. And also the dysfunction of this network is involved in substance use disorders. So now sort of trying to put everything together here, reward, dopamine, and fatigue. In other work, we've shown that hypoactivation in the basal ganglia in MS and TBI, which suggests low levels of dopamine. We know that pharmaceutical manipulations that increase dopamine seem to reduce fatigue, although the evidence isn't all that awesome. And so the question here is, can rewards be used to reduce fatigue in MS? And so we looked at it in this paper where we asked, does activation in the frontal striatal network through rewarded behavior reduce fatigue in MS and controls? And reward here is money, which is most people find pretty motivating. Okay, and we gave them a card. We used a card guessing task, and I had two conditions. One in which there was this reward where subjects were told they could win money if they correctly guessed the card, but it was actually a chance. And And then the other condition was a no reward condition where they knew that they could not, they would not win money in that condition. And those were randomized. And we, again, assess subjects' subjective fatigue before and after each condition using a visual analog scale of fatigue. And so here are the results. So this is a change in fatigue across time, and healthy controls here on the left and MS on the right. And you can see that in the rewarded condition, the healthy controls actually showed a little less fatigue as they went along, versus when they were not rewarded, where they showed increased fatigue as they worked through this task. In the MS group, they showed more fatigue as they went along in both conditions, but fatigue was reduced in the rewarded condition. And in terms of the brain activation, we have activation in the ventral striatum. And here on the left, you can see that in the rewarded condition, there's more activation in the healthy control group than in the no reward condition, and that's also true in the MS group. And then the same is true here on the right. Okay, so what do we take away from this? Rewarded behavior leads to decreased on-task fatigue in MS and healthy control. And rewarded behavior leads to increased activation of the motivational network in MS and healthy controls during the reward condition, and specifically the striatum of the basal ganglia. And so the reward system in MS can be used to reduce fatigue, evidently, even though it seems to be not working that well, but it still does work. So, you know, and so I think this is really promising, and it shows that, you know, folks with MS, they seem to have a working fatigue system, and that we may be able to leverage that. And it seems to work just like it's working in healthy controls. And I put the word flow here because flow is this the state that you can achieve when you're like doing something that's intrinsically rewarding, that you really love to do, and you get lost in it, and then you look up and 2 hours have gone by, and you don't know where the time has gone. And you know, one of the things that's happened there is you have not experienced fatigue, even though you've been working constantly on this task for 2 hours. And so I think, yeah, so, you know, I think we can leverage this. You know, I think that is an example of how we can avoid fatigue through, you know, motivated behavior. And I think that also works in MS. Okay, and so this may generalize to other intrinsically rewarding activities to reduce fatigue, like exercise. And changing the balance between effort and reward, that is to say the payoff matrix, by increasing the reward seems to reduce fatigue, which supports the idea that fatigue is a signal the brain generates when the payoff matrix has changed for the worse. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the basal ganglia, and fatigue is more than the basal ganglia. I want to make that point. A hub is just a place without a network. So this is just a flight map of some airline that I got off the web, and you can see that the airline. You know, you can see the hubs in this network, and you know, if you know, and to the extent that you know U.S. geography, you can tell which cities are the hubs, but they're only hubs by virtue of the connections, right? And so. There seems to be a fatigue network, and that's comprised of the caudate nucleus, of the basal ganglia, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the insula. And together, these areas have been shown to be related to fatigue in Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis, which I've shown you today, some of that work. In TBI, in stroke, in chronic fatigue syndrome, and in Gulf War illness. And yeah, so overall conclusions. Fatigue does affect performance. Participants become less sensitive and more conservative as fatigue increases. And that's also true in MS as well as in controls. Individuals with MS report persistent fatigue and are persistently more conservative. We've supported the Sturi and Vahan model. Caudate nucleus seems to play an important role in fatigue, and it seems to have a blunted and reversed response in MS. But there is hope in that rewards counteract the blunted response in the basal ganglia in MS. And this suggests that interventions that target the dopaminergic system may help with fatigue in MS. So what is fatigue? As I hope I made clear, I think that fatigue may be a signal the brain generates when it detects a change in the payoff matrix or the balance between effort and reward. Any self-organizing system like the brain needs some way to tell itself that the task it's doing is no longer worth pursuing when there's a disadvantageous change in the payoff matrix. And I think that's what fatigue is. And I also think that after brain injury or disease, many aspects of cognition take more resources. And that's why these populations report persistent fatigue. And so, you know, I don't find going grocery shopping to be intrinsically rewarding. And you know, and there's that phrase, you know, I get tired just thinking about it. And so if everything takes more effort, then, you know, you're probably persistently fatigued. And with that, I just want to thank my collaborators and my funding agents. How did we do for time? We did pretty well. All right. All right, questions. Let's see, do you want to?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Wylie. Now the floor is open for questions. You can actually raise your hand or you can put it on chat and I can ask. So it's up to you.
Do you want to get rid of the screen?
Oh, yeah.
Chat.
Okay. How to?
So stop share, then raise that hand.
Oh. No.
Click here.
Click down there, get rid of that. And then just,
Just red.
there you go. Hey. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Error.
Yes, thanks, Professor. That was very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you about the phenomenon of cognitive overload, which many clinicians, particularly surgeons, have flagged to us as one of the main blockers in their practice, and how having this cognitive overload can, or the threshold for cognitive overload is lower when they are fatigued, when they have been in theater for several hours or consecutive days. Or we see the same thing with nurses that are doing shifts in the ICU. The longer the shifts, or when they are not arranged properly, then they are more likely to experience fatigue in addition to cognitive overload. So I was wondering if you have looked at this phenomenon and possible intersections between them both.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I've talked to doctors and residents about, you know, looking at fatigue in, you know, in hospital staff, because it's a big deal. And yeah, so I mean, in terms of fatigue and cognitive overload, I think that those things are related because of, you know, decreased cognitive resources. Like if you've been on rounds for, you know, whatever it is, 27 hours, you're running low on cognitive resources, and therefore you're fatigued because, you know, the rewards aren't really changing. And maybe you can shake off fatigue, you know, if you know there's an event and it's rewarding to respond to that event, right? So that's on the side. So, you know, so you've been on rounds for 27 hours and you're low on cognitive resources and you feel fatigued, and you're probably also prone to cognitive overload because you're low on cognitive resources. So I think it's one of those things where fatigue and overload may be correlated, but because they're both related to something else. That would be my guess on that one.
Thank you. And do you mind if I follow up with another question?
Yes, Edward, please go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of the loss of sleep, I was wondering in your studies, how do you ensure that there are no confounding factors when individuals are going through a sleep loss because of stressful events or the disease they are experiencing, or any other factors that compound to it? Because we know well that loss of sleep can also induce fatigue. So how do you know what factors are contributing and by how much to the fatigue that you're measuring through these methods?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. So yeah, so we do a full neuropsych battery as well, and so we use the what is it? Is it the Edinburgh sleep inventory? We use the sleep inventory to find out how people are sleeping and make sure that that's not explaining the results. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. I'll catch up with you later.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Edward. Any more questions?
Hi, can I?
Yes, Prof. Yes.
Hi, Professor. Thank you. That's a very interesting presentation. And I have a few questions, and particularly with your analogy of the flight path and the different centers working as a hub. My question is, as a clinician, if we disrupt one hub, do you think will it have a domino effect on the other hubs? Stimulating one area can have a positive impact or some kind of an impact on the other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know that we can a priori, predict what that impact will be. But yeah, I mean, if you have traffic going into and out of a hub and you disrupt that hub, then one would imagine the traffic would get diverted to other hubs. I mean, that's certainly what happens in the airline industry. And we also see that in traumatic brain injury, right? So you have disruption of these long-range fibers. And so, we knew that for years and years, and we called TBI a disconnection syndrome. And then people were really surprised to find increases in connectivity in TBI when people started to look at connectivity in TBI. But the connectivity was local, right? The increase in connectivity in TBI is an increase in local connectivity. And so it's like, yeah, these long-range fibers are damaged. And so, but the information still has to get through. And so it's sort of taking local roads instead of the highways. And that's not something that people predicted, right? So I think that they would, to answer your question, yeah, if you disrupt a hub or you make a hub work better, it's definitely going to have an effect on the rest of the network and how information moves through that network. But I don't know that we have sufficiently sophisticated understanding of the network to predict what's going to happen.
Thank you. Can I put a few other questions as well on that line?
Yes, please. I don't think there's any hands up, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is something similar to follow up with the previous question Eder asked about the sleep. I work with the children and I treat children with an acquired brain injury. That's my clinical job. When it comes to sleep, the literatures clearly indicate there's a strong correlation between fatigue and the sleep. But what I'm coming across in my clinical practice is about there are two different type of kids. One, they don't sleep at all, but they still get fatigue. The opposite spectrum, they sleep excessively, but still get fatigue. I'm just wondering, this completely contradictory state of sleep, but directly correlating with the fatigue in acquired brain injury, not only a traumatic brain injury, I'm also talking about meningitis, encephalitis, and other conditions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, fatigue and sleep are different things, right? But they're highly related, right? And so And I have not got, become an expert in sleep. Because we've been looking at fatigue in clinical populations like MS and TBI, and in a lot of those folks, they have unrefreshing sleep, right? So they sleep and they're still fatigued, which is one of the groups you were just describing. And so we're trying to figure, so we said, okay, well, let's try to figure out what this fatigue is. But yeah, that would be really interesting to look at the people who don't sleep and are not fatigued. It would be interesting to see what's going on in their brains, and we haven't looked at that. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's absolutely open area. I do not know, because when I look at it, there's one common correlating factor with the children I'm talking about, because that's my specialty. These kids invariably have one consequences, which is poor academic performance. And whether they have sleep or not, but the fatigue is somewhat related to academic performance. These kids need some kind of an additional support at school through a standardized or non-standardized format. One way or other, they are struggling quite a lot in academic performance.
Yeah. I mean, we know that sleep is, it's related to memory, right? And that seems to be one of the things our brains are doing when we're asleep. And also, sleep is cleaning out it's allowing the brain to sort of wash out the waste products. And so if you're not really consolidating memories, and also if you're not really effectively getting rid of waste products in your brain, those seem like they would both be a big drag on learning and would make learning more effortful, and probably make everything more effortful, because so much of what we do is related to memory, right? So I can see it linked to fatigue in that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So next, I think Scarlett.
Hello, I was just wondering, have you seen a difference between the fatigue in patients with disorders and diseases like Parkinson's or chronic fatigue syndrome, and then the fatigue that you would see in someone who's like perhaps sleep deprived or overworked, rather than relating to a disorder? Is there a difference in how it manifests in the brain, or is it a similar mechanism?
I think that's a good question. I think it's the same mechanism. But yeah, so if I become fatigued, then a good night's sleep usually sorts me out, right? And I'm okay the next day. That's not true so much after brain injury or disease, and these folks have unrefreshing sleep. And so that's a difference. But I think that the difference there has more, I think that has more to do with the effort required for folks like who have brain injury and disease to do anything, for cognition to work, rather than a difference in their fatigue. I think the fatigue is the same. And the way I think about this is having a temperature. Like, you can have a temperature because you have COVID, or you can have a temperature because you have some sort of infection, or whatever. And that having a temperature is just sort of this generalized way that your body has of indicating alarm and trying to fix things. And I think that's what fatigue is. It's like this sort of generalized feeling that we have when things are not, when this balance between effort and reward is not right. And it's time to change what we're doing. And I think that there are lots of ways that we can get there and find ourselves fatigued. And the ways that you described are several of those ways. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, that does. I was just wondering in things like chronic fatigue syndrome, when necessarily the cause of the fatigue is unknown, do you have any like ideas about why that?
Yeah, we've looked at fatigue in Gulf War illness, which is similar to chronic fatigue syndrome. They both have this post-exertional malaise component, where if you exercise or do something strenuous on day one, you can do it, but then on day two you're wiped out. You have this sort of overwhelming fatigue, and when we looked there, they also had a difference in the activity in their basal ganglia. But they also had a difference in their attentional network. Their attentional network was sort of hyperactive, as though they were always, they were sort of always on. They were always attending to things, or their attention system was working harder all the time. And I don't know what that means, but there was a difference in their brain. Both in terms of the fatigue network that we've talked about, but then also in terms of this attentional system that seems to be active all the time. So we haven't followed that up to look at that, to see if that generalizes to chronic fatigue syndrome, because that was just in veterans with Gulf War illness. But that would be a good thing to do, definitely.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you. Next, Edward, please. Yeah.
Hi, just one more question about the TBI relationship with fatigue. So I understand you're trying to see whether this is the origin of this phenomenon is in a brain network. And I'm wondering why that's the case, not interactions with other systems in the body, in particular endocrine glands. So I'm asking because we have been looking at time series hormonal data from patients that had TBI, and there is a striking difference between those that had pituitary damage and those who didn't. Obviously, pituitary damage will affect the HPA axis and responsiveness, and I wonder if that's something that maybe needs to be taken into consideration in addition to the interactions between these different brain regions. Or maybe you already talked about this and made a decision of why should be just looking at the brain.
Right. Yeah, no. I think that there's a lot to look at, absolutely. And the brain is just one. The brain is just one component. And the brain, is kind of, the brain is where the readout happens, right? And so that's where we've been looking. But so if let's back away from cognitive fatigue for a minute. With physical fatigue, people have thought for a long time that physical fatigue is this mechanism that helps you maintain homeostasis, right? So you don't overuse your arm, for example. And so you, in order to protect those muscles, you eventually feel this fatigue and you just can't go on. Even though if you go in and stimulate those muscles externally, you find that they still have strength and they can still perform, but your brain just stops being able to innervate them. I don't know if it stopped able to, but it stops innervating them and you feel fatigue. And so, so I think there is this element of homeostasis, of trying to maintain homeostasis, which is part of fatigue, particularly physical fatigue. There may be an element of that in mental fatigue as well. And so when you have a virus, and I've certainly, you get the flu and I've gotten the flu and I found, I come downstairs to get, a cup of soup or something and I'm out of breath. And it's like, this is not, I haven't used my muscles that much. Like I'm not really this fatigued, or I shouldn't be this fatigued, but but I clearly am. And so I think that there's this, I think that goes back to the homeostasis thing. So to what extent trying to maintain homeostasis plays into mental fatigue, we haven't thought too much about that, or at least I haven't thought too much about that. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth considering and looking at.
Yeah, I certainly like the idea. It makes sense to me that fatigue is a way for the brain to tell us to just take a break, right? Which makes sense within the homeostasis theory of this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Edward. I think Abhijit is next.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for the wonderful talk, although I joined late. And I think that this last question was a very important question, because the fatigue is, there are many constructs in the fatigue. What do you want to understand about fatigue, and how, depending on where you are coming from? And so, because from the neurology perspective, we see fatigue in the wide range of disorders from any, and it's quite common in any immunologic manifestations, from myasthenia gravis to other neurosarcoidosis. And again, post long COVID, it has taken a new shape, but we do see overlap. And there's another group of patients in where fatigue is a very common manifestation. We call them functional neurological disorder. So probably you are right, probably, and also I agree that HPA axis plays a role, but we have to understand that HPA axis also gets affected by a lot of other things happening inside the brain, our cognitive states, our emotional state, and so it also gets affected. So fatigue is possibly ultimately the mismatch between the brain's readout and the other thing. But yeah, but I completely agree. We need to have a comprehensive approach, and as much as we can look around to identify what's going on, and your construct regarding the brain network is a very useful pathway or a tool to get in there. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we need or benefit from is a better tool set to assess fatigue. So that's why I spent some time at the beginning of this talk knocking what we currently use to assess fatigue, which is these retrospective self-reports. So what we've used is we induce fatigue and we measure what happens in the brain. And I think that's a better approach, because it's much more tightly controlled. And I think if we do that in diseases like FND, that would really help us nail down what's going on there.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, is there any more questions?
Oh, yeah, we're at the hour.
Almost a year. Okay, thank you very much for joining, and thanks, Professor Wylie, for your visit. So we'll keep on the discussion. We have actually a meeting with